think fruit was just food in the Wild West? It was actually a status symbol that told everyone exactly where you stood in society. The difference between eating an apple and eating an orange wasn't just taste. It was the difference between being middle class and being truly wealthy. And for the poor, they weren't eating either. Their struggle wasn't just about getting enough to eat, it was about accessing foods that proved you'd climbed the social ladder. And it all started with one simple truth. Fresh fruit in the frontier was a luxury most people never tasted. The poor ate wild berries and foraged fruit if they were lucky, choke cherries, wild plums, and whatever grew naturally along rivers and in forests. These weren't cultivated or cared for, they were survival food that anyone could pick for free. No investment required, no land ownership needed, just knowledge of where to look and when to harvest. Wild fruit was unpredictable. Some years the bushes would be loaded, other years drought or late frost would kill the crop. Poor families couldn't count on wild fruit, they just took what nature provided. Choke cherries were abundant across the plains but lived up to their name. They were so astringent they'd make your mouth pucker and your throat tighten. Eating them raw was an exercise in desperation. The tannins in choke cherries were so strong that your mouth would feel dry and rough for hours after eating them. Most people would boil choke cherries with whatever sugar they could afford to make preserves that were barely palatable. But sugar was expensive, so poor families often made choke cherry preserves with minimal sweetening. The result was a bitter, barely edible spread that was better than nothing, but not by much. The labor of processing choke cherries was intense. The pits had to be removed or the preserves would taste even worse. Poor women and children would spend hours pitting tiny cherries, their hands stained dark purple. The stains wouldn't wash out for days, marking them as people who foraged for survival. Wild plums grew along creek beds and in thickets. These were smaller and more sour than cultivated varieties, but they were free. Poor families would gather them in late summer, competing with birds and other foragers. The best spots were jealously guarded secrets passed down through families. The plums were small, maybe an inch in diameter with large pits and little flesh. You'd have to eat a dozen to get the same amount of fruit as one cultivated plum, but poor families would gather them by the bushel, making preserves or drying them for winter. Wild grapes grew on vines along rivers. They were tiny compared to cultivated grapes, mostly seed with little flesh. The flavor was intensely sour and sometimes bitter, but they could be eaten fresh or dried into raisins that were hard as pebbles. The labor of picking enough wild grapes to matter was enormous. The vines grew high in trees requiring climbing or long poles to reach. The grapes were scattered rather than in tight bunches. A full day of picking might yield only a few pounds, but labor was all poor people had, so they spent it gathering free food. Service berries, also called June berries, ripened in early summer in mountain regions. They were sweet and actually pleasant to eat, making them highly sought after. But they grew in limited areas, and you had to know where to find them before someone else did. The competition for service berries was fierce. Families would guard their picking spots and sometimes come to blows with others who tried to harvest from their bushes. Even though the berries grew wild on public land, territorial disputes were common and occasionally violent. Elderberries were common but required processing. Raw elderberries could make you sick, causing nausea and digestive problems. They had to be cooked into preserves or fermented into wine. Poor families would gather them because they were abundant. But the preparation was time-consuming and the risk of getting sick from improper preparation was real. Blackberries and raspberries grew wild in many areas, but harvesting them was painful work. The thorns would tear skin and clothing. Poor children would return from berry picking with scratched arms and torn clothes, visible evidence of their family's poverty. But the berries were sweet and worth the pain. The social stigma of eating wild fruit was real and cutting. It marked you as someone who couldn't afford better. Children who showed up at school with wild berry stains on their clothes and hands were immediately identified as poor. Other children would mock them, and teachers would look down on them. Wild fruit gathering was also dangerous in ways that went beyond social embarrassment. You'd be out in remote areas where you could get lost, injured, or encounter wildlife. Rattlesnakes loved berry thickets because rodents fed on fallen fruit. Bears competed for the same fruit, and a surprise bear was a deadly bear. Poor people took these risks because they had no alternative. The choice was risk injury or death gathering wild fruit, or go without fruit entirely. Most chose to take the risk because fruit provided vitamins and variety in diets that were otherwise monotonous and nutritionally inadequate. The timing of wild fruit harvest was critical and inflexible. Berries ripened on nature's schedule, not yours. If you were working elsewhere when the fruit ripened, you missed it. Poor families would sometimes skip paid work to gather wild fruit because the free food was worth more than a day's wages. But if you managed to climb into the middle class, everything changed. Suddenly you had access to fruit that was cultivated, predictable, and socially acceptable. Apples were the defining fruit of the middle class. If you had an apple orchard, you'd made it. You owned land, had water rights, and could afford to wait years for trees to produce. This wasn't subsistence living. This was investment in the future. An apple tree took 5 to 7 years from planting to first harvest. That's 5 to 7 years of watering, protecting from animals, and hoping disease didn't kill your investment. Poor people couldn't afford to think that far ahead. They needed food now, not in 5 years. The initial investment in apple trees was substantial. Saplings had to be purchased or grafted from existing trees. The grafting process required knowledge and skill that not everyone possessed. You couldn't just plant apple seeds and expect good fruit. Seeds produced unpredictable results, often reverting to wild, inedible varieties. The varieties grown in the Wild West were different from modern apples. These were hardy varieties that could survive harsh winters and hot summers. Names like Arkansas Black, Wolf River, and Wealthy were common. They weren't as sweet or perfect as modern apples, but they were reliable producers in difficult conditions. Apple orchards required constant maintenance throughout the year. Pruning in winter shaped the trees and removed dead wood. Thinning fruit in summer ensured larger, better apples. Protecting from pests year-round was a never-ending battle against insects, diseases, and animals. This was skilled labor that required knowledge passed down through generations or learned through expensive mistakes. Middle-class families either did this work themselves, demonstrating their competence and work ethic, or hired help, demonstrating their wealth and management skills. The harvest was a major event that defined fall for middle-class families. Apples ripened over several weeks in autumn, and the entire crop had to be picked at the right time. Too early and the apples wouldn't be sweet. Too late and they'd fall and bruise. Families would work from dawn to dusk during harvest season. Children were pulled from school to help with apple harvest. This was considered acceptable because orchard works was respectable middle-class labor, unlike foraging for wild berries. The distinction was important in maintaining social status. The apples that weren't eaten fresh had to be preserved for winter. This required additional labor and resources. Drying apples was the most common preservation method. Apples would be peeled, cored, and sliced thin. These slices would be laid out in the sun or hung in dry areas until all moisture was removed. Dried apples could last for years if stored properly. In dry conditions, they were used in pies, stews, and eaten as snacks throughout winter. A pantry well stocked with dried apples was a sign of a successful harvest and good household management. Root cellars stored fresh apples through winter. The cool, humid environment kept apples from shriveling while preventing freezing. A well-managed root cellar could keep apples fresh until spring, providing fresh fruit when nothing else was available. Building and maintaining a root cellar required resources that poor families didn't have. You needed to dig deep enough to reach stable temperatures, line the walls to prevent collapse, and create ventilation systems. This infrastructure investment separated the middle class from the poor. The social implications of having apples were significant and far-reaching. You could give apples as gifts, demonstrating generosity and social standing. You could trade apples for other goods, creating economic opportunities beyond simple consumption. You could serve apple pie to guests, showing hospitality and success. Apple cider was another marker of middle-class status. Fresh cider required a press, which was an expensive piece of equipment that cost as much as a month's wages. Hard cider required time and knowledge of fermentation. Both products were valuable and demonstrated that you had resources beyond basic survival. Cider pressing was often a community event where middle-class families would share equipment and labor. These gatherings reinforced social bonds within the middle class while excluding the poor who had no apples to contribute. Peaches were even more prestigious than apples within the middle-class hierarchy. They required warmer climates and more careful cultivation. A successful peach orchard meant you'd chosen your land well and had the skills to manage delicate trees that were more susceptible to disease and frost damage than apples. Peach trees were temperamental and required more attention than apple trees. Late spring frosts could kill the blossoms, destroying an entire year's crop. Diseases like peach leaf curl could devastate orchards. Successfully growing peaches demonstrated horticultural skill that commanded respect. Peaches had to be eaten quickly or preserved immediately after harvest. They'd ripen all at once and spoil within days in the summer heat. This meant middle-class families had to have the time, equipment, and knowledge to can or dry large quantities of peaches in a short window. The labor was intense, but the result was worth it. Canned peaches were a luxury that middle-class families could enjoy all winter. The process required glass jars, which were expensive and had to be purchased new or carefully preserved from previous years. Sugar for the syrup was also costly. A pantry full of canned peaches was a visible display of wealth and competence. Guests would be shown the pantry with its rows of canned peaches, preserved in perfect golden halves floating in syrup. This display was intentional, demonstrating the household's success and the woman's skill in preservation. Pears were less common than apples, but still within reach of the middle class. They required similar growing conditions to apples, but were considered slightly more refined. Serving pears meant you had diverse orchards and sophisticated tastes that went beyond basic apple cultivation. Cherries were difficult to grow and protect from birds, making them a premium middle-class fruit. Birds would strip a cherry tree in hours if it wasn't protected with netting. A cherry tree that actually produced fruit for human consumption was a point of pride and a topic of conversation among neighbors. Cherry preserves were special treats saved for important occasions. The labor of pitting cherries was enormous, but the resulting preserves were prized for their intense flavor and beautiful color. Serving cherry preserves to guests was a way of honoring them with something precious. The middle class could also afford to buy fruit occasionally from traveling merchants or at town markets. This wasn't their primary source, but it supplemented what they grew. Being able to purchase fruit demonstrated disposable income that poor families didn't have. Buying fruit was done carefully and publicly. Middle-class women would inspect fruit at markets, demonstrating their knowledge and standards. The transaction was as much about being seen buying fruit as it was about acquiring the fruit itself. But even the best middle-class orchard couldn't compete with what the truly wealthy could access. The rich didn't just eat better fruit. They ate fruit that most people had never even seen. Oranges were the ultimate status symbol in the Wild West. These weren't grown locally except in Southern California. They had to be shipped from distant orchards or imported from even farther away. The cost was astronomical, and the logistics were nearly impossible. Eating an orange meant you were wealthy enough to afford luxuries that defied reason. The transportation challenge was enormous and expensive. Oranges had to travel hundreds or thousands of miles by wagon, stagecoach, or eventually railroad. They'd spoil quickly in heat. They'd freeze in cold. They'd be crushed by rough handling. The percentage that arrived in edible condition was small, which drove prices even higher. Merchants who specialized in shipping oranges to frontier towns took enormous risks. A shipment could be completely lost to weather or accidents. The successful shipments had to cover the losses, making prices even more extreme. A single orange could cost $1 or more in remote mining towns. That's the equivalent of a day's wages for a laborer or a week's worth of basic food. Most working people would never spend that much on a single piece of fruit that would be gone in minutes. But for the wealthy, the price was irrelevant. The point was demonstrating that you could afford it. Oranges appeared at Christmas as special gifts for wealthy children. Finding an orange in your stocking meant your family had money and connections to acquire rare luxuries. Poor children might receive a piece of candy if they were lucky. Middle-class children might get an apple from the family orchard. But an orange that was reserved for the elite. The tradition of Christmas oranges became so associated with wealth that it created a cultural marker. Adults would remember whether they'd received oranges as children, and that memory defined their understanding of their childhood social class. The taste was exotic and unfamiliar to most frontier people. The sweetness, the acidity, the perfume of the peel, all of it was completely different from anything that grew locally. Eating an orange was a sensory experience that marked you as worldly and sophisticated. Many people didn't know how to eat an orange the first time they encountered one. The peel was confusing. Some would try to eat it like an apple, biting through the bitter rind. Others would peel it incorrectly, wasting precious fruit. Knowing how to properly peel and eat an orange was itself a marker of sophistication. Wealthy families would display oranges in their homes before eating them. A bowl of oranges on the table was a status symbol that announced your wealth to visitors. The bright color stood out in frontier homes that were otherwise drab and utilitarian. The oranges would sit for days, slowly deteriorating, but the display was worth more than the fruit. Some wealthy people would give oranges as gifts to demonstrate their generosity and social position. Receiving an orange from a wealthy patron was a reminder of the social hierarchy. You were being given something precious that you could never afford yourself. The gift created obligation and reinforced power dynamics. Lemons were even more rare and expensive than oranges. They were used medicinally more than as food. Wealthy families would have lemons on hand to treat scurvy or add to drinks. The extreme sourness made them less desirable as eating fruit, but their rarity made them valuable. Lemon juice was used in cooking by wealthy households that could afford both the lemons and the refined recipes that called for them. Cookbooks from back east would list lemon as an ingredient, but only wealthy frontier families could actually follow these recipes. This was cuisine that separated the wealthy from everyone else. The medicinal use of lemons was well known but inaccessible to most people. Scurvy was common on the frontier, but the cure, citrus fruit, was too expensive for those who needed it most. Wealthy families could prevent scurvy easily. Poor families would suffer and sometimes die from a disease that money could prevent. Bananas were the most exotic fruit in the Wild West, and they only appeared in the later frontier era when railroad transportation improved. Even then, they were incredibly expensive and rare. Most people lived their entire lives without seeing a banana, let alone tasting one. Bananas had to be shipped green and would ripen during transport. The timing had to be perfect, too early, and they'd arrive rock hard and inedible, too late, and they'd be rotten mush. The logistics made them even more expensive than oranges, which at least could survive the journey more reliably. Wealthy merchants in larger frontier towns might stock bananas occasionally when a shipment arrived in good condition. They'd be sold individually at prices that made them pure luxury items. Buying a banana was a statement that money was no object, and that you valued novelty and status over practicality. The taste was so unusual that many people didn't like bananas the first time they tried them. The texture was strange and mushy. The flavor was unlike anything else available, but that unfamiliarity was part of the appeal for the wealthy. It proved you'd experience things that common people hadn't. Some wealthy people would host banana tastings, inviting other wealthy friends to experience this exotic fruit together. These events were social occasions that reinforced elite bonds while excluding everyone else. Dried fruits were more accessible to the wealthy than fresh exotic fruits, but they were still expensive and marked clear class distinctions. Raisins, dried apricots, and dried figs were imported from California or overseas. They appeared in wealthy households baking and cooking. Raisins in particular were used in cakes and puddings that demonstrated culinary sophistication. A cake with raisins wasn't just food, it was a display of wealth and access to imported goods. Serving such desserts to guests reinforced social hierarchies and demonstrated the host's status. Apricots grew in some parts of the West but were difficult to cultivate successfully. Dried apricots were easier to transport than fresh ones and could be stored for long periods. Wealthy families would buy them by the pound, using them in compotes and desserts that middle-class families couldn't afford. The wealthy also had access to canned fruits from commercial operations back east. While middle-class families canned their own fruit from their orchards, the wealthy could buy commercially canned peaches, pears, and even pineapple. The labels on these cans were often ornate and colorful, turning the cans themselves into status symbols. Pineapple was perhaps the most exotic canned fruit available. It came from Hawaii or tropical regions and was so expensive that it appeared only at the most elaborate wealthy gatherings. Serving pineapple was the ultimate display of wealth and access to global trade networks. Fruit at wealthy dinner parties was served as a separate course, often with cheese and nuts. This European-style dining was completely foreign to most frontier people who ate simple, functional meals where everything appeared on the table at once. The ritual of fruit service demonstrated cultural sophistication and wealth. The presentation of fruit at wealthy tables was elaborate. Fruit would be arranged artistically on fine china or crystal dishes. The serving itself was a performance that demonstrated refinement and education in proper etiquette. Wealthy families would have fruit year-round through a combination of their own orchards, root cellar storage, preserved fruits, and purchased imports. Poor families had fruit only when they could forage it in season. Middle-class families had fruit seasonally from their orchards and preservation efforts. The wealthy had fruit whenever they wanted it, in whatever variety they desired. The social divisions created by fruit access were stark and visible to everyone. You could tell someone's social class by what fruit they ate, how they ate it. And when they had access to it, fruit wasn't just nutrition, it was a marker of where you stood in frontier society. Children learned these class distinctions early and internalized them deeply. Poor children knew that wild berries were their lot and that they shouldn't aspire to more. Middle-class children took pride in their family's orchard and understood it represented their parents' success. Wealthy children expected oranges at Christmas and thought nothing of it, assuming this was normal. These early experiences shaped their understanding of social hierarchy and their place within it. The fruit you ate as a child determined your expectations for adulthood and your understanding of what was possible. The resentment was real and sometimes explosive. Poor people working as laborers would see wealthy families eating oranges and feel the injustice of a system where some people could afford luxuries while others struggled to survive. Fruit became a symbol of inequality that was visible and undeniable. Some labor disputes and social tensions in frontier towns were partly fueled by these visible inequalities, when wealthy mine owners ate oranges while their workers couldn't afford apples. The contrast created anger that sometimes erupted into strikes or violence. Middle-class families aspired to wealth partly through the lens of fruit. If they could afford to buy an orange occasionally, they were moving up. If they could serve imported dried fruits at holidays, they were approaching the upper class. Fruit was a measurable marker of social mobility that everyone understood. The wealthy used fruit to maintain social boundaries deliberately and consciously. By serving exotic fruits at parties and gatherings, they reminded everyone of the economic gap. You couldn't fake having oranges. Either you could afford them or you couldn't. There was no middle ground, no way to pretend. Some wealthy families would be ostentatious about their fruit consumption, eating oranges in public or having servants carry fruit baskets through town. This display was intentional. designed to reinforce their position at the top of the social hierarchy. So there you have it. Fruit in the Wild West wasn't just food, it was a complete social hierarchy made visible and edible. Wild berries marked you as poor and struggling. Apples proved you were middle class and successful. Oranges announced you were wealthy and powerful. Every bite told a story about who you were and where you belonged in frontier society. Makes you think differently about fruit, doesn't it? Those frontier people would be amazed by modern grocery stores where anyone can buy oranges. For pocket change, the fruit that once separated the rich from the poor is now available to everyone. But in the Wild West, an orange wasn't just fruit. It was proof that you'd made it to the top of a very steep social ladder, and everyone else was still climbing.